Hello, everyone. Greetings, and welcome back to the last uh, chapter that the calendar is going to allow me to get to, and it's going to be economic policy. Um, I could have gone into the media, political campaigns, and whatnot. They'd be very interesting. I just felt that you can kind of pick up a lot of that, plethora of that, via social media and whatnot. I do feel that economic policy probably needs to be reined in um, before we leave this semester, and it's probably a source of well, I think the misunderstanding of it that people have. Tax policy, fiscal policy is a well, I think the ignorance sometimes creates undue problems. I think if we understood more of this, it would go a long way toward maybe keeping some semblance of peace, in our society. Back in 2009, 2010, we had a movement in this country called the Tea Party movement. I talked about them back when we were face to face in class. Tea Party movement. Basically, it didn't have a. It was in the country, uh, pretty much via the country classes, and it was basically a revolution against government spending, right? Trying to rein that in, make the government more accountable to Americans. I think it worked for a little while. It seemed to, uh, after the 2012 elections, it seemed to um, abate, evaporated, dissolved. There's a word I'm looking for. The momentum of it, right? So we're going to take a look at some of those the nuts and bolts of government spending, government policy, probably some of the movement ignited that movement, and decisions that's being made and how all that stuff's allocated. If you have your lecture model, the objectives here I only went into uh, with the notes is just to compare the efficacy, if you will, of private and public sector approaches to social assistance, right? Public assistance, public sector, the government, right? Private, the folks, right? The country classes, and then I want to understand the evolution of and activist government. Some of the heads up terms here we're going to talk about. I'm going to mention the Grangers. These were agrarian protest groups. Interstate Commerce Act. That was the regulation of railroad rates, early 20th century, kind of radical at the time. Trusts, large-scale monopolies. Part of all that era there was to bust trusts up. Sherman Antitrust Act, right? Added legal teeth to doing that, designed to prohibit monopolies. And this is all under the Teddy Roosevelt era, a Republican. Laissez-faire, right? Hands off. Government hands off. French term. Hands off. Smoot-Hawley tariff doesn't often get a lot of recognition for its hand in exacerbating the Great Depression. Didn't bring it about, but the Great Depression was a cut on the leg. The Smoot-Hawley tariff didn't bandage it up. It tore it apart even wider. Basically protectionist trade policies in 1930. The act went into play due to the Great Depression to try to keep people buying American. And what ends up happening is the Europeans end up taking their gold reserves out of the U.S. The Employment Act. Federal government gets involved in maintaining employment. The Taft-Hartley Act prohibits the number of union activities Feather bedding. These are measures to avoid unemployment. Corvette, 1960 to 1969, was a Chevy car that was made, and the federal government didn't feel it was safe enough, so they had Chevy take it off the market. The Federal Reserve Board, regulatory monetary policy. Securities, I mean deposits, right? Deposits. Fiscal policy. Deficit. This is borrowing, appropriation, and appropriation. And then the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and they help prepare budgets. So let's get into this here for the last lecture of the semester. The U.S. economic system, basically free market, right? There's a role for government regulations. The government's role, write laws, create mechanisms for contract enforcement, business and bankruptcy rules. They're in charge of that. Making a definition of what property rights are, the issuance of patent and copyrights, and the provision of a common monetary system, and then the granting of corporate charters. So the debate of the degree of regulation, as we know, is much contested today, as witnessed by environmental. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the history of the role of government in our economy from the 19th century through the Cold War into present debates about the nature and extent of government regulation in the economy. The roots of government intervention in the economy, and have your first set here of some fills. In the first 100 years of our country, most economic issues were handled by the states, not the national government. Now, the national government's roles were limited to public land policies, a few public works projects, and the encouragement of business, and certain economic policies through the use of taxes and tariffs. Now, the states were quite active in promoting and regulating private business activities. They built Erie Canal. They built roads and railroads. States licensed, regulated, and inspected many factories and businesses. Now, during the 19th century, when the country was mostly rural and small scale, this was okay. This worked fine. Following the Civil War, before and the growth of government, following the Civil War, the country became more and more industrialized. Cities grew up around factories. Then with the factories, you had industrial accidents. During this time here, you had disease outbreaks, conflicts, factories, unemployment, and exploitation of workers were problems too large for state governments alone. Another problem was the business cycle. Or we talk about business cycles, we're talking about fluctuations between periods of economic prosperity and sometimes economic downturns that were common. And basic laws of modern, certainly free market economics. The economic swings were difficult to do personally as a country, and in not understanding the nature of your economic, economy that overheats and then has a downturn. In a free market economy, you have that equilibrium point where at some point, just based off self-interest, the consumers and the producers come to some kind of agreement on prices. And as Adam Smith would say, the invisible hand of the free market kind of regulates itself. And not understanding this is really the crux of what gets us into trouble in the 1920s. But we're not up to the task. Many people start turning to the national government to address the problems. But many folks still subscribe to the idea of laissez-faire, right? Laissez-faire. The only proper role for government was to stick to, maintaining order and justice, conduct foreign affairs, provide public works, such as lighthouses and roads that, would be unprofitable for private businesses to meddle with, be a waste of their time. Now take a look at your notes here again. Small business, reformers in the cities, the Grangers, and agrarian protest groups banded together over time, and national government lean in what they saw as capitalism run amok. So in 1887, Congress began to regulate the railroads by adopting the Interstate Commerce Act. And that act required that railroad rates be just and reasonable, and prohibited rate discrimination along with that, and the practice of charging substantially short hauls than long ones. Now we have some white space there, some notes. 3 years later, the same coalition of political forces forced Congress to deal with these trusts, or large-scale monopolies, monopolistic businesses, I guess, right, that dominate like oil, salt, whiskey, meat packing, and sugar. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 prohibits the restraint of trade and monopolies. Enter the Progressive Era, right? The Progressive Era, and movement was a middle class movement, middle class reform movement, designed to change the political, economic, and social system of the U.S. So in general, they wanted to rein in corporate power and make it more responsive to society at large and the democratically elected government. So a variety of legislation was discussed and passed by Congress during this era. Congress created to name a few, the Food and Drug Administration, right? Federal Trade Commission, FTC, Reserve, picking out some that largely familiar, right? And there were more. Government was just taking on new roles at the time, and automatically. So these extra duties meant that government needed new sources of revenue, to pay for this. Public officials instituted an income tax, right? The income tax that you know and love, here it is. So in 1913, Congress passed the 16th Amendment. These taxes are now a major source of revenue for the federal government. Let's move into the Great Depression and the New Deal. You see some of your notes here that I want you to know for the last quiz. World War I ended the Progressive Era. And let me just say this. I don't have this in my notes. The Progressive Era was based on the underlying premise that to reform, you can behave. Well, World War I happens, right? People are not behaving, right? Going to war like this. The other thing, too, that cast, that type of mindset of the progressives in under a suspicious or even jaundiced light was the Prohibition. So yes, you had some problems. You had some problems in the 20s, and then World War II happens again in the 30s, right? So, but during the 20s, the laissez-faire, hands off, government hands off, returns under Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Not so much with Herbert Hoover. And one of the misnomers of American history is that Herbert Hoover didn't do enough. You know, his hands were off too much. History shows he did too much. You know, looking at after the economy began to overheat in the late 20s, it was Hoover involved with government stimulus, right? Government stimulus and government intervention that exacerbates the problem. It doesn't. Perhaps if he would have the free market to run its course, maybe we wouldn't be talking about the 1929 Great Depression. So the economy was booming, right? The economy was booming in the 20s, and all was right with the world, right? All was right with the world. Then came October 27th, 1929. The Great Depression begins with a stock market collapse, followed by rising unemployment, dropping prices, falling production, and financial panic. Unemployment gets up to about 19-20%. Kind of stays there until we get to World War I, and that kind of takes us out of the Great Depression. So, but it was kind of like what we're experiencing now. Keep mentioning this with every lecture. Virus, right? Just worldwide catastrophe, economic downturn that produced large amounts of economic distress. I'm afraid that may be the case at this time period as well. So all sectors of the economy were hurt. No social groups or classes were spared, and I mean some fared better than others. But President Hoover, getting back to Hoover continued to meddle in the economy, hence leading to the Smoot-Hawley trade tariff, right? Smoot-Hawley, trying to get people to here in the U.S. to buy American, and it causes a trade war, causes Europeans to panic and pull their gold out of the U.S. So the panic gets worse. During the 1932 presidential elections, countries gripped by the Great Depression. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He calls for a New Deal for America, favors a strong government to relieve economic distress and reform capitalism. This was a major turning point for the U.S. from basically a laissez-faire economy to really an interventionist state. The New Deal had the national government as a major regulator of private business and a provider of Social Security as well. So we moved to the post-World War II era. During the 1940s and 50s, most policies remained people back to transition to the economy in the 50s. However, as we came out of World War II, many policymakers again worried that the conversion from a wartime to a peacetime economy might trigger another Great Depression. Again, when you're having economic problems, sometimes, well, probably all the time, if you take a look at what the politicians are doing, that might give you a pretty good indicator of where some of the blame lies. And they got involved again. Two significant developments during this era were the Employment Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. Both of these pieces of legislation were controversial and dealt with concerning jobs. Now, they don't really screw the economy up here, but anytime the politicians get leaning too heavily in on the natural work of the free markets, I think it's a cause to get a little nervous. The Employment Act was a watered-down version of the Murray Bill, introduced by Senator Murray, a Democrat out of Montana. The Murray Bill guaranteed a right to employment for anyone willing and able to work. Anyone willing and able to work. So the hope was to maintain full employment and stave off another depression. Full employment, by the way, is generally regarded by economists as no more than 5% unemployed. All right, that's have it under economy doing good, right? So the hope was to maintain full employment, stave off another depression. The mechanism that Murray advocated to maintain full employment was government investment. During private investment, to him, proved inadequate. Conservatives, naturally, they opposed the bill very strongly. The resulting compromise was the Employment Act of 1946 that said that the federal government had the ability to use all practical means to promote maximum employment. The act also created the Council of Economic Advisors to advise the president on economic issues, and the Joint Economic Committee in Congress to study economic policy. And these agencies are around today, like probably all government agencies. Whether we need them or not, they don't go away. So the Taft-Hartley Act also dealt with labor issues, but in a different way. That gave trade unions the right to collectively bargain. Again, that had been strongly opposed too by conservatives and businesses. So in 1946, the Republicans became a majority in Congress and vowed to change the law and increase the power of management in labor disputes. So the result was the Taft-Hartley Act. And this act prohibited a number of union activities such as feather bedding, jurisdictional strikes, and forcing employees. Unions were then directed to file detailed reports on their finances to the Department of Labor. There was to be this kind of closed shop arrangement under which an employer could only hire union workers. That too was prohibited. I'll take a look at your notes here. The Employment Act was deemed a liberal demand on government to become involved in employment policy. The Taft-Hartley Act was a conservative demand for the same type of involvement. So obviously, the government was now firmly entrenched. You get the picture here, get firmly entrenched in the economic life of the country, in the late 40s, early 50s, right? Social regulation, so the policy regulation. However, once we move into the 1960s and the 70s, the government turned to social regulations. Social regulations deal with the quality and safety of products. Agencies such as you'll know of some of these, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Transportation Safety Administration, and more were created to protect consumers and citizens from a variety of threats. Another thing under the waterline, and you don't have to write this down for your notes, but under the waterline, what's going on here too, you see a shift from the concerns in the 50s into the 60s, going from more bread and butter issues to social issues, right? And on the liberal Democrat side of the aisle, political scheme of things, start to see a shift. Old school Democrat to what we see today, to more modern, progressive, concerned about the social issues. And so you see under the waterline a shift, starting to see a shift there too. Four factors contributed to the surge of social regulation. One of those, the 1960s and 70s, were a time of social activism, right? Social activism, consumer and environmental movements flourished, and public interest groups were formed that demanded government action. Again, you see that the shift here. Secondly, modern technology proliferated and highlighted unsafe products like chemicals, DDT, cigarettes, leaded gasoline, the Corvair, right, a very popular car, phosphates, and more. Toxic substances in the air, pouring them into the water, and burying them into the ground. TV showed us these problems, and people were getting ticked. 3, advocating situation as a way to enhance their reputations and electoral prospects. Imagine that, politician doing that. This, in and of itself, was not new, but TV was. TV was. And then fourthly, the presidents in office during this time, LBJ and Nixon, supported the movement. Again, it was good politics. The 1970s, latter part of the 70s, deregulation. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, a new movement arose, deregulation. Economic regulation came under fire from a variety of angles as being anti-competitive and anti-consumer. In fact, going back to the Corvair, very popular car, critics of the regulation that put it out of business basically claimed the problem to the eyes of some of the progressive reformers was that it wasn't built to tank-like proportions, and it didn't need to be shelved like it was. But so many people saw regulating agencies as protecting the industry's profit margin rather than the public good. During the Carter administration, deregulation was a priority, and airlines, financial institutions, and more were deregulated, and that kind of went up, maybe as they would say, on steroids during the Reagan administration in the 80s. Now, stabilizing the economy. I want to talk about that for a little bit before we get into monetary policy. Stabilizing the economy. Prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s, little role. In 1936, in response to the Depression, John Maynard Keynes wrote that government should use deficit spending during economic downturns. In fact, I should probably say this too. Keynes wrote a tract in 1923, I believe it was. I think it was called, one of them was called On Monetary Reform. I think it was the one in 1923. And this was something that the politicians were reading. And I had said that they began to panic, on starting to overheat and then trying to find some equilibrium point. A lot of these guys were reading Keynes. And I'm not saying Keynes had any blame in causing the Great Depression, but it did encourage more government intervention. Fast forwarding to the present, interest rate cuts are due to Keynes's ideas of government intervention and interest rate cuts, fiscal stimulus packages. Got one ongoing right now, right? To help see the nation through this time before we get the economy going again, right? And more have become common. So monetary policy, we're talking about monetary policy. We're talking about controlling money supply, right? Again, more government intervention. Monetary policy involves the regulation of a country's money supply and interest rates in order to stabilize the economy. The primary responsibility for monetary policy rests with the Federal Reserve, right, created in the 1910s. The Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, as we call it, was created in 1913 and is a mixture of private interests and public property, and it consists of the following. This bullet point you need there, the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board, or in brackets, you could put the FRB. Second bullet point, Federal Open Market Committee. The Federal Open Market Committee. And then thirdly, you have 12 Federal Reserve banks. I was looking at your chapter with your author, visuals of that. Check that out, you visual types. Sometimes I'm not visual. I'm the most detail-oriented person in any stretch. So, might behoove you to look in your domestic policy chapter and see if there's a visual of that. So you have that, and then the FRB. The FRB is made up of 7 members appointed by the president for 14-year overlapping terms with approval of the Senate. A member can be removed for stated causes, although that's never happened. One board member is designated as chair for a 4-year term. The chair's term runs from midway through one presidential term to the middle of the next to ensure economic stability during changes during administration. So in order to control the money supply, the Fed has a number of tools or levers, including manipulating the environment. So the amount of deposits member banks are required to keep on hand are not, they're not on loan. Let's see here. I think I'm having a battery issue here. I think I forgot to, speaking of details, forgot to plug this in. I did. Let me just plug this in. Pardon me for a minute. So raising the reserve requirement is a limit, basically a limit on loan making by banks, and therefore restricts the money supply. Point here, the rate of interest that member banks have to pay to borrow money from the Fed. So if the Fed raises the discount rate, it makes loans more expensive. And so restricts the money supply. Third and last bullet point here, another tool of the Fed, open market operations. And that's the buying and selling of securities by the Fed in the securities markets. So when the FRB, the Federal Reserve Board, buys securities, banks have more money to make loans. And therefore the money supply is enlarged. So if the FRB sells securities, the opposite, the inverse is true. Presidents and the FRB, though technically the FRB is independent of the president, there's a lot of informal contact during luncheons and meetings. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, this is taxing and spending. Fiscal policy involves taxation and government spending policies to influence overall operation of the economy. Fiscal policies formulated by the President and Congress through the process. JFK, right? John F. Kennedy was the first president to actively use fiscal policy. He deliberately ran a deficit in order to fuel economic growth. Tax cuts were considered to stimulate the private sector spending and thus would also be a stimulus to the economy. Since Kennedy, most presidents and Congresses have run deficits. Kennedy was campaigning in 63, and he saw a lot of poverty down the Appalachian area, and he wanted to help pay for poverty programs, and he do that was cut taxes into the government from the private sector, and it worked. It worked. I want to just touch on globalization here for a minute. The effects of globalization. You hear a lot about that today. Globalization refers to the process by which countries and businesses are more closely linked than ever, despite great geographical distance. Free trade has been the most lucrative aspect of globalization for the U.S. However, our current president looked at trade deals with China and some others, and I guess mostly all of them. And the only one, I'll be honest with you, the only one I looked at, and I didn't look at China. I looked at our trade deal with Germany, regarding automobiles, and it looked to me like we were making some stupid decisions over the years here, and which leads credence to some of many of Mr. Trump's arguments. So, globalization here in the United States, here in the last since 2017, has taken a little more of a jaundiced eye. Right, we'll have to see how that goes. Trade unions, I don't think they're crying too much over they've been very critical of free trade. They argue that low-paying jobs overseas rob American workers, right, of jobs here in the United States. Generally, they lean heavily toward the Democratic Party. President Trump has the R in front of his name, so we'll see how that. I'm looking to see how that relationship works out. The budget process and how the federal government raises and spends money. The federal budget is primarily funded through individual income taxes and social insurance / retirement receipts and from these sources. Most government spending goes to national defense and human resources such as health, income security, and Social Security. I think less than 30% of that is, at least it was, goes to the military. So the human resources share of government spending is at least 70%, right? Congress and the budget process, right? The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 gave the president, looking at your notes here, the authority to prepare an annual budget and submit it to Congress. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, is created to assist the president in preparing the budget. Federal budgets operate on a fiscal year, not a calendar year, that runs from October 1st to September 30th. Now, the OMB provides the bureaucracy with instructions and guidance on presidential priorities to help them prepare their budget requests 9 months before the president actually needs to send it to Congress. So the president sends its budget to Congress in February each year. The departments develop detailed funding requests, and the OMB puts them together. Agency requests are often modified by the OMB, and a dirty little hidden secret here, I don't think I included this in on your notes, there are also each year 12% increases cooked into the federal budget. The idea there is it's kind of like a rainy day fund. Like, all right, cooked a 12% in there in case, they're needed in some kind of emergencies. Well, when you hear about cuts in Congress, when you hear about cuts, these talking about it. They're talking about these. First off, they're talking about these increases just that are kind of cooked into the books. So the math doesn't really even out. There's really not any. There really never any cuts in the actual budget. It's generally in the rainy day funds. So remember that, right? It's when they're screaming about cuts, it's stuff they're already being, it's already being padded on to the budget. So now, since the Constitution grants Congress the power of appropriation, Congress debates the budget in subcommittee, committee, and then finally on the floor of each house. And eventually, appropriation bills are authored and voted on. The budget is passed. Lately, due to a large amount of conflict between Congress and the president, budgets have not been passed before the beginning of the fiscal year, and Congress has had to pass continuing resolutions to keep the government and its programs running or let the government shut down. The public was very upset in 1995 and 96 when the government shut down and blamed many Republicans who had just taken over Congress, blamed many Republicans for the inconveniences. The last federal budget that got passed was in 2016, and before that, not after the Bush administration. So Congress has not done real good in passing budgets in the last 20 years, right? Can you imagine if we did that in our homes? So the budget's not a very good tool for stabilizing the economy due to the lag time. Budgets are prepared far in advance, and the politics, right? It's hard to get a cogent budget put together. Just in closing here, some budget initiatives of the last two administrations. Probably too early to put some kind of a grade or assessment on the Trump administration as yet, even as his first term isn't out. Budget initiatives under George W. Bush, we'll look at that one. 2001, Bush signed the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act that lowered income tax rates across the board. I remember buying my first home here, and I needed a washer and dryer hookup. And I remember there was debates in Congress about the tax cuts. And I remember this was like summer 2001, and I remember the tax cuts came in, and I was able to afford the washer and dryer hookups. And so over the winter, when I didn't have to hang up clothes on the clothesline in January, I was very thankful for that. Bush also focused on the war on terrorism, $27 billion for military and homeland security. He also called on Congress to create a Department of Homeland Security, which he did, which was, if I may, security welds together CIA, FBI information. Before Bush came into office, they always did that independently, and if need be, they would coalesce together. Some bad things were going on in the late 90s. They were severed, and the Homeland Security, big leviathan of thousands of more bureaucrats, right? And it's never going to go anywhere, regardless if we need it or not. Not a good thing. 2003, Bush called for further tax cuts due to the continuing stagnation in the American economy. And February 2008, he unveiled a $3.1 trillion budget that increased defense spending to fight the war on terror. War on terror really drained us, right? Terrible. Probably had to do it to a large extent. Obama administration 2009 stimulus package. This, along with the Affordable Health Care Act in 2010, lot of unrestrained government spending brings about the Tea Party movement, right? Stimulus package. Kind of looking back on that, it really didn't go too much to the economy. Looks like it went to like 60-70% of that to pay off, you know, right? Probably not a good thing either. And then the budget deficit and the debt. Since the early 1980s, the U.S. has run large budget deficits and has had a rapidly growing national debt. When we talk about deficit, that means that the spending is larger than income in a given year, and the debt is the accumulation of deficits over the years. And if you want to take a look at a really horrible era of that, was tax cuts again. Ronald Reagan enacted tax cuts on August of 1981. We were in a terrible, he inherited a terrible economy, 13% inflation, cut taxes, and it worked. It worked to the tune of giving us the largest, best humming peacetime economy in our nation's history up to that point. But we ran deficits because the government was taking all of those record number of tax receipts, and not only did they spend that, but they were spending more money. They were getting, president wasn't vetoing spending proposals by the Congress, so we ended up spending more money than we. So, I guess I say all that to say I don't know if we'll ever be able to pay our own way, as long as we half of the electorate will not hold their elected representatives accountable. It really comes down to that, right? As big as the Tea Party movement was, still had many people who are either of Washington, their skids were getting greased, and we're just looking at what worked for them. I don't know. So anyway, just kind of wrapping this up here, we looked at demographic organizer, the roots of in the economy. Early on, the states controlled all of this. Economic issues, Fed's role back then, public policies, some public works projects, taxes and tariffs. Laissez-faire economics was the day, right? Government hands off. Roaring 20s, business cycle, right? Overheating causes the stock market to crash. A lot of government intervention really did not let the visible hand of the free market correct itself. Self-interest of consumers and producers, right? Leads to the Great Depression and your New Deal programs, heavy on government intervention. Then you have the post-World War II era, the Employment Act of 1946, Taft-Hartley Act, kind of a liberal act, conservative act. Regulations of the 70s, OSHA, right? The name of EPA, to name a few. And then deregulation, late 70s of the Carter era, and certainly into the Reagan era. And then you have fiscal policy we talked about. Fiscal policy, basically talking here about taxing and spending through president and Congress. You have a budget process. Tax cuts can be used to stimulate the economy, and usually you like to run deficits when you do that. Stabilizing the economy through monetary policy, interest rates, money supply. Federal Reserve System was created in 1913. Control the reserve requirements and manipulate interest rates. And then Congress and the budget process, right? President submits an annual budget to Congress. The OMB, Office of Management and Budget, was created to assist the president in this. The fiscal year for the budget process starts at October 1st every year, ends at September 30th. President sends a budget to Congress each February. Departments develop funding requests assisted by the OMB, and Congress has the ultimate power of appropriating funds. So for my Tuesday, Thursday group up in Ebensburg, you guys finish up. We'll be finishing up on the 30th. You'll have your final that day, so I will have a different scope and sequence for you guys on how I allocate any practice work to you. And for both groups, we're not going to quiz on this. I'm going to have information on this on the final. I will have information on this on the final. Actually, my Monday, Wednesday group in Richland, I think we probably will quiz on this. We will quiz on this. If we do not, if I change my mind on this, I will let you know via an update, right? So, but anyway, both groups, I will work out the details, goal, run in the goal line in the final. I'll let you know in more detail. I'm just kind of thinking out loud right now. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. So, but that's kind of where we're at. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me. I'm always available outside of Sundays, right? So until then, you guys stay healthy and study hard and finish strong, okay? See you next time, I guess, whenever that may be. Bye-bye.